Hello. August Wilson is one of the finest American dramatists of the past 50 years, I think, and he's certainly the premier African American playwright of his generation. Wilson's primary work is his 10-part collection, written over 30 years, known as the Pittsburgh Cycle. The title refers not only to the setting of most of these plays, but to the city where Wilson himself was born and grew up. Using a changing cast of characters, each of the 10 plays treats the evolving African American experience from the first decade of the 20th century through the last. While the cycle covers a full century, the 10 plays weren't written in the historical order of their settings. Fences, for example, which is one of Wilson's masterworks, was the second play he composed, written in 1983 and staged for the first time in 1985 with James Earl Jones as Troy. But its setting is in the 1950s, making it the fifth play within the historical unfolding. Fences won both the Pulitzer Prize and the Tony Award, and since then it has been mounted as a splendid film adaptation that you may know, starring Denzel Washington and Viola Davis. Among the other celebrated plays in Wilson's cycle are The Piano Lesson, set during the Great Depression in the 1930s, and Ma Rainey's Black Bottom, set in the 1920s and focusing on a blues singer. If you haven't seen the new film version of that play, starring the late Chadwick Boseman and Viola Davis again, I strongly recommend it. Another play in the cycle, Joe Turner's Come and Gone, takes place in a boarding house in the decade following 1910. Well, Wilson completed the final installment in this Pittsburgh Cycle, titled Radio Golf, shortly before he died at the age of 60 in 2005. In fact, he died just as the play was about to open on Broadway. Wilson explained that his overarching intention in dramatizing African American lives over 100 years was, quote, to raise consciousness through theater. And he means not just the historical and cultural consciousness of American blacks, but also the moral consciousness of white audiences and readers. As he said, he wanted whites to see themselves in the struggling black characters and their families, and to identify with them across the racial divide and thus recognize, quote, the same things, the same experiences in their daily lives as in the lives of the black characters. Specifically, he put it, love, honor, beauty, betrayal, and duty, end quote. All of which we find in abundance in Troy Maxson in Fences. But Wilson's plays also make us acutely aware that the races don't share certain things, and Wilson explains this in his short preface to Fences. Both the white immigrants to America and black descendants of slaves had dreams, he notes, but only the whites were permitted to nourish their dreams of advancement. And as we'll see, the awareness of this inequity is at the heart of Troy Maxson's protest in 1957 when Fences is set. Troy is ahead of his time because the civil rights movement was still a decade in the future, when Troy's demand for equity in the workplace wouldn't then have been such a lonely one. As his friend Bono tells Troy, you've just come along too early. It's true. In his resistance to economic and social inequality, Troy was born a decade too soon, and he is an impatient man. He's not an incrementalist. Slow changes in the 1950s, like Jackie Robinson's breaking the color barrier for the Brooklyn Dodgers, those things aren't enough to impress Troy. When his wife, Rose, mentions it, he's rather dismissive. Rose says folks had to wait for Jackie Robinson, to which Troy says, hell, I know teams Jackie Robinson couldn't even make. What are you talking about, Jackie Robinson? Jackie Robinson was a nobody. I'm talking about if you could play ball then, they ought to have let you play then. Don't care what color you were. Come telling me I come along too early. No. Now, similarly, Troy is not impressed that a local black man named Pope has been able to buy and run a restaurant because Pope's attitude, Troy suggests, still reflects the slave mentality, a mentality that Troy himself very much protests. He says, man, he bought the restaurant down there, fixed it up real nice, and then didn't want nobody to come into it. A Negro go in there and can't get no kind of service. I seen a white fellow come in there and get a bowl of stew. Pope picked all the meat out of the pot for him. Man ain't had nothing but a bowl of meat. Negro come by and ain't got nothing but potatoes and carrots. Yeah. Now, Troy is 53 when this play opens, having worked hard for low wages as a garbage collector for decades. He's fed up, and he demands now more than slow symbolic changes in race relations in America. Now, it is useful to know that August Wilson was himself biracial. His mother was African American, and his father, named Kittle, was a white German immigrant who later divorced his mother. The future playwright paid homage to his mother by changing his last name from Kittle to Wilson, which was her maiden name. Wilson's family lived in a rather run-down section of Pittsburgh called the Hill District, and it is here that Fences is set, even though the exact location is never explicitly mentioned. Wilson's education in Pittsburgh was rather checkered. He attended 3 different high schools, one of them Catholic, but he was restless and he never graduated. Instead, he dropped out and spent many hours reading in the city's Carnegie Public Library, where he discovered and devoured the works of prominent African American writers, the novelist Ralph Ellison and Richard Wright, and the poet Langston Hughes. Indeed, like Lorca, Wilson began writing his writing career as a poet before he turned to theater. Wilson was, to a large degree then, self-educated, an autodidact. Now, one writer that he certainly did read with care was Arthur Miller, because Fences is, I hope you noted, in perpetual conversation with Death of a Salesman. The plays offer some fascinating points of similarity and contrast. The similarities begin with their settings in post-war America, within 8 years of one another. Both men own rather dilapidated houses in what Wilson calls a big city neighborhood, and the family home in both plays is the primary locus of activity. Indeed, in Fences, the front yard and porch are the only setting which gives the play a kind of classical unity of place. Like Willie Loman, Troy is a frustrated and dissatisfied man, tired of his job and worried about making enough money to support his family. And again, like Willie, Troy feels discriminated against, not because of his age, as Willie does, but because of his race. Nevertheless, like Willie, Troy brings his grievances to his boss, Mr. Rand, as he tells his friend Bono at the beginning of the play. I went to Mr. Rand and asked him why you got the white men's driving and the colored lifting. Told him, what's the matter, don't I count? You think only white fellas got sense enough to drive a truck? Ain't no paper job. Hell, anybody can drive a truck. How come all the white driving and all the colored lifting? And he told me, take it to the union. Well, hell, that's what I done. Now they want to come up with a pack of lies to subvert me. Now, note that, like Willie, again, we find a crucial similarity in that Troy has 2 sons, one of whom, Corey, is a football star, certainly recalling Biff. Troy's contentious relationship with Corey also recalls Willie's struggles with Biff, as both fathers try and fail to direct the course of their sons' lives. Both Troy and Willie also have devoted wives. In fact, Wilson's description of Rose and her feelings for Troy echo Miller's description of Linda's understanding, admiration, and forgiveness of Willie. We're told in the stage directions that Rose is 10 years younger than Troy. Her devotion to him stems from her recognition of the possibilities of her life without him. A succession of abusive men and their babies, a life of partying and running in the streets, the church, or aloneness with its attendant pain and frustration. But she also recognizes Troy's spirit as fine and illuminating. She either ignores or forgives his faults, or some of which she recognizes. Now, you'll note that as Linda does with Willie, Rose sees and values Troy's inner spirit, something other people don't see. She is his support. Yet Troy and Willie both sexually betray the woman who loves them and whom they love. Each of these 2 men also has a supportive male friend in the plays. Charlie, in Death of a Salesman, and Bono, clearly in Fences, men in whom the protagonist confides. Both Troy and Willie also die near the end of their plays, both of which conclude with their funerals. Finally, I think, and most significant, like Willie Loman, Troy Maxson conforms to Miller's paradigm of a common man whose tragedy lies in his attempts to assert his dignity and to affirm his rightful place in a world that tries to deny him that dignity. Now, that said, there are also glaring differences between Troy and Willie that we should bear in mind, beginning with the fact that Troy has no faith in the American dream of financial success that Willie both nurtures and misunderstands. Troy never really believed that a black man could rise and become wealthy in America, a la Horatio Alger, and Troy's own bitter experience confirms this disbelief. The prejudicial color barrier kept him from becoming a Major League Baseball player, and he certainly had the talent for it. Unlike Willie, Troy, however, has at least learned from his past failures and bitter disappointments. He harbors no illusions of the kind that Willie does. He says, when Bono says times have changed, he says, no. There should have never been no time when it was too early for a man like me to play ball. He says, there ain't but two men ever played baseball as good as you, Bono says, and that's Babe Ruth and Josh Gibson. Them's the only two men ever hit more home runs than you. To which Troy says, what it ever get me? Ain't got a pot to piss in or a window to throw it out of. Now, Troy's remark here reveals another important departure from Willie. Troy also doesn't look to his sons to redeem his failures vicariously. He looks at his own bitter past and doesn't imagine that somehow Corey is going to succeed where he failed. Certainly not as an athlete. In fact, when Corey is recruited by a college to play football, just as Biff was, Troy discourages Corey and demands that he work at the A&P if he wants to play high school football at all, and indeed jeopardizes his ability to do that. Rose says, Corey Dunn went and got recruited by college football team, to which Troy says, I told that boy about that football stuff. The white man ain't going to let him get nowhere with that football. He ought to go and get recruited in how to fix cars or something where he can make a living. Troy's remark here reveals, I think, still another sharp difference from Willie Loman that we should bear in mind. Willie regards physical labor of the kind he's actually good at as beneath him and beneath his dreams. But Troy is a manual laborer who, while discontent, still believes in the value of hard work, even if it is underpaid. We see this when his elder son, Lyons, a sometimes musician and full-time sponger, comes to Troy asking for a loan. He really wants a handout, of course, on what he knows is Troy's payday. And Troy's admonition is this: why ain't you working? Oh, Pop, I can't find no decent job. Where am I going to get a job at? I can't get no job. To which Troy says, I told you, I know some people down there. I can get you on the rubbish if you want to work. I told you the last time you come here asking for something. Oh, Pop, thanks, but that ain't me. I don't want to be carrying nobody's rubbish. I don't want to be punching nobody's time clock. To which Troy says, what's the matter? You too good to carry people's rubbish? Where do you think that $10 you're taking from come? I just supposed to haul people's rubbish and give my money to you because you're too lazy to work? Now, note that Willie, by contrast, infects Biff and Happy with the fraudulent idea that hard work isn't necessary, that popularity rather than work brings success. Troy's gospel, however, is based on hard lessons that he has learned in his past, lessons that he doesn't want his sons to repeat. You don't get anywhere if you don't work. He says to Lyons, you live in the fast life, as Troy himself once did. Want to be a musician, running around in them clubs and things, and then you learn to take care of yourself. You ain't going to find me going and asking nobody for nothing. I done spent too many years without. I done learned my mistake, Lyons, and learned to do what's right by it. You still trying to get by something for nothing. Now, Willie, while Troy sounds, when he says this, he sounds almost like the anti-Willie. But Lyons, like Biff, nonetheless, blames his father for his own failings as a man. Lyons later says to Troy, I'm 34 years old, the same age, by the way, as we find Biff. I'm 34 years old. If you wanted to change me, you should have been there when I was growing up. Now, perhaps one reason Troy allows Rose to give Lyons the $10 that he comes asking for is that he feels guilty for abandoning Lyons' mother and Lyons himself, leaving the mother to raise him alone. Well, while Troy's contentious relationship with both of his sons recalls Willie's, Wilson suggests, I think, an important difference, and it's a crucial difference, in that relationship in the play's epigraph. It goes this way: when the sins of our fathers visit us, we do not have to play host. We can banish them with forgiveness as God in his largeness and laws. Wilson wrote the epigraph himself. He's not quoting anyone here. Now, those lines would definitely not apply to Biff and Happy, because both of those young men reproduce Willie's errors, repeat his sins, and carry on his flawed, dishonest approaches to the world that he taught them through his words and example, even though they both recognize how fraudulent those lessons were. They somehow have been unable to escape them. Both of them seem destined to perpetuate and suffer from Willie's mistakes, even after his death. But Wilson's epigraph suggests that in fences, the transmission of a father's sins to his children need not doom those children. That Corey doesn't inevitably have to inherit and reenact Troy's resentment of the world, his betrayal of his wife, and his emotional brutality. He can escape those things, as the epigraph suggests, through acts of forgiveness. Only forgiveness can short-circuit that legacy of reproducing and becoming your father. But will this actually occur? Will it be possible for Corey, through forgiveness, to avoid becoming Troy or reproducing his sins? Well, in addressing this question, I think we need to consider how Troy himself wrestles with the memory of his own past, his own tyrannical father, and the influence that father had on him, this sharecropper, the effect he had on his son, a baseball player who was barred from the major leagues, who became a felon and served time in prison before he married Rose. Well, that past in Troy's life shapes his behavior as a father and produces the psychological conflicts within Troy that are at the heart of his tragic character, many of which trace back to his relationship with his father. Now, unlike Troy's father, who drove Troy's mother away, Troy, at the beginning of this play, wants to preserve Rose, his second wife. And he also wants to teach Corey discipline so that he doesn't fall into the dissipation that Troy did himself as a young man. And this becomes clear in the first scene together, in which we see them together, in which they work on building the fence. Troy says, "Your first chore, Corey, is to help me with this fence on Saturday. Everything else comes after that. Now get that saw and cut them boards." Corey, taking the saw, begins cutting the boards. Troy continues working. There's a long pause. "Hey, Pop, why don't you buy a TV?" "What I want with a TV? What I want one for?" Well, Corey says, "Everybody's got one. Earl and Brad, Jesse. I ain't ask you who had one. I say what I want with one." To which Corey says, "So you can watch it. They got lots of things on TV, baseball games and everything. We could watch the World Series." Now, note that this occurs while they are building the fence. Beginning. The play's title, Fences, refers then literally to this partially completed wooden fence in the front yard that Troy wants Corey to help him finish with the lumber that they are cutting. Figuratively, Fences reflects Troy's impulse to protect Corey from making laziness and trust of white men a practice in his life. But for Troy, the fence is more complicated because it is also, for him personally, a symbol of domestic restriction that confines his freedom as a male. Both the play's title, Fences, and the actual fence also refer to Rose's desire to preserve her family, to fence it in, if you will, and to her belief in God's protection. Indeed, she invokes this notion of the fence as a symbol of God's protection of the family in a song she sings. Jesus, be a fence all around me every day. Jesus, I want you to protect me as I travel on my way. Jesus, be a fence all around me every day. Now, Troy has been building the fence around his yard for some time, a piece at a time. And although he's using, we're told, good hard wood, this delay in finishing the fence has to do with the fact that it is not his idea. Rose wants the fence and has been asking him to build it for a while. Troy understands why. He understands what the fence means to her. He explains this to Corey when they return to the fence building in Act 2. Speaking of it in relation to Rose, Corey says, I don't see why Mama want a fence around the yard nowadays. To which Troy says, damn if I do neither. What the hell's she keeping out with it? She ain't got nothing nobody want. But then Bono explains to him, some people build fences to keep people out, and other people build fences to keep people in. Rose wants to hold on to you all. She loves you. Yes, as I suggested, for Rose, the fence is a form of containment, holding the family together. Now, Troy understands that for Rose, the fence means the protection and enclosure for family and her marriage. Although Bono explains it, he clearly understands this himself. For her, the fence is a symbol of her desire to hold on to Corey and Troy. And note that for Rose, this is a response to her own troubled past, where her parents produced children from multiple relationships and there was no sense of family cohesion or unity at all. The fence for Rose, then, is a protection against this sense of family dispersal and betrayal and rootlessness that she grew up with as a child. And she explains this clearly to Troy after he has betrayed her with Alberta, explaining why it is that she desires this family unity that he senses, but which now she offers the origin. She says, and you know, she says, I've been married 18 years, and I got to live to see the day you tell me you've been seeing another woman and done fathered a child by her. And you know, I ain't never wanted half of nothing in my but my family. My whole family is half. Everybody's got fathers and mothers, but my two sisters and my brother can hardly tell who's who. Can't never sit down and talk about a papa and a mama. It's your papa and your mama and my papa and my mama. I ain't never wanted that for my children. Yeah. Thus the desire for the unified family unit she never had growing up herself. Note that before this, then, Troy has understood it, but not as clearly as he does now. Before Troy began building the fence as a tribute to Rose, clearly fences meant very different things to him. They meant restriction, they meant confinement, and they even meant a kind of emasculation insofar as they bound him to a single woman. Now, as Bono rightly points out, fences can function to keep people out or to hold people in, which is what Rose wants. Rose wants hers as an expression of inclusion, but Troy knows from his own experience that fences also can exclude, and he demonstrates this later when he and Corey quarrel in Act 2. Troy orders his son to, quote, get away from my house, and he says all of his son Corey's possessions will soon be, quote, on the other side of that fence. He's ostracizing him, using the fence to exclude him. But as a black man, Troy has faced that kind of exclusion himself repeatedly. He found himself at various times in his life on the other side of fences from the privileged white world. His sense of racial exclusion is bound up with the fences, for example, that surround baseball fields. Troy says he could hit a ball over those fences. He could hit a baseball 450 feet when he was in his prime 30 years earlier. But the white establishment fenced him out of the major leagues. Thus, he regards fences as a form of restriction. Troy keeps a baseball attached to a rope in his yard with a bat nearby. For him, they are reminders both of the player that he once was and bitterly of what he could have achieved had he been able to on a level playing field. When he hits the tethered ball now, attached to the rope, it never leaves the yard, never clears the fence, just as Troy was never able to follow the flight, the trajectory of his own prodigious talent. Thus, for Troy, a fence means something that can confine you if you're behind it, or it can keep you out if you're trying to move beyond it to something better. Well, Troy is a complex and contradictory protagonist. He's a man of manifold inner conflicts, as we'll see, and Wilson suggests this sense of a kind of inner tension within him in the very opening stage directions. There, we are told, that he is a 53-year-old man, a large man with thick, heavy hands. It is this largeness that strives to fill out and make an accommodation with. Together with his blackness, his largeness informs his sensibilities and the choices he has made in life. Now, like Willie Loman, Troy is full of frustrated strivings. They're as large as the description suggests Troy is physically. But unlike Willie, Troy has a countervailing need, as this passage suggests, to make what Wilson calls accommodation with reality, to recognize, despite his strivings, that there are limits to those strivings, and that one must recognize those limits in order to live. This doesn't mean that Troy won't stand up for himself when it comes to going to the union and arguing that black garbage men should be able to drive trucks, but rather it means his understanding, his keen awareness of the need as an African American to accommodate himself to certain other conditions, to certain other restrictions. This tension then between aspiration and accommodation informs also Troy's attitude toward change. On the one hand, he pushes for it insofar as he becomes a driver by going to the union. But on the other, he dismisses what he regards as merely symbolic, slow, or insufficient forms of African American progress in the mid-1950s. When Bono says that Troy was born too early, Troy replies, there ought never to have been no time called too early. Well, paradoxically, Troy believes in the value and necessity of hard work that Willie fails to understand, but he hates the biased system of labor that he works under and resents that even though he regards the work itself as valuable. Another tension in Troy that emerges early in the play is his attitude toward the cultural past. On the one hand, Troy despises the racial cliches that present blacks as backward, which is why he wants to dissociate himself from the worker who stole a watermelon. But on the other hand, Troy actively embraces certain stereotypical aspects of black masculinity. He loves pig's feet. He shops at a place where he says, the people been good to me, even though it's more expensive. And he tells tales on his front porch in a kind of vernacular way that seems to be part of a masculinist tradition. He also hearkens to this masculinist tradition when he orders Rose back to the kitchen saying, this is men talk, woman, as he and Bono on the Friday night swig their regular pint of gin. This sexism reflects still another contradiction in Troy. We see him embrace Rose and declare, I love this woman so much it hurts, but he still betrays her with the younger Alberta, who bears his illegitimate child. Now, it's as if, as a middle-aged man, Troy feels he's entitled to that kind of philandering as a man. Despite his claims to Bono that he has no interest in Alberta, we see him preparing to walk to her house at the end of Scene 2 in Act 1. When Rose says, you've been running out here every Saturday for weeks, we realize that the affair is long-standing, as Rose will later discover. Now, Troy is proud of his sexual prowess, both in his marriage and outside it, and likes to flaunt it, as when he recalls how he and Rose got together. Saw Rose and latched onto her. I latched onto her and told her I'm going to tell you the truth. And I told her, baby, I don't want to marry. I just want to be your man. Rose told me, tell him what you told me, Rose. I told him if he wasn't the marrying kind, then move on out of the way so the marrying kind could find me. Yeah, I thought it over for 2 or 3 days. You ain't 2 or 3 days, nothing. You were back the same night. Troy doesn't deny it. Come back, told her, okay, baby, but I'm going to buy me a banty rooster and put him out there in the backyard, and when he see a stranger come, he'll flap his wings and crow. Look here, Bono, I could watch the front door myself. It was that back door I was worried about. Well, this is a piece of vernacular. A man who cheats on his wife with another woman is sometimes called a backdoor man. And Troy says, yeah, I wanted to buy a rooster to make sure that no other man came in for my wife through the back door. And yet, ironically, of course, he becomes a backdoor man himself in his affair with Alberta. He becomes the very kind of man he claims he wanted to guard against in his marriage at the beginning. Well, perhaps the most glaring contradiction or conflict in Troy is his mixture of extreme pride, even hubris, on the one hand, and his sense of failure on the other. These feelings are really co-functional because his tendency to brag in some way seems kind of compensation for the sense of failure within. Troy presents himself in his tales on the porch as a kind of mythic hero, clearly hyperbolic, even if he does so with a certain sense of humor. He transforms the pneumonia fever he suffered, for example, in the past into an epic confrontation with death, in which he is the hero. Yes, I say, you want to hear? You know what, Mr. Death? You be wanting me? You done brought your army, then be getting me. I looked death right dead in the eye. I wasn't fearing nothing. I was ready to tangle, just like I'm ready to tangle now. Yeah, the Bible says be ever vigilant. Death, he was standing there. He was staring at me. You know what? I reached down and I grabbed that sickle of his and I threw it as far as I could throw it, and me and him commenced to wrestle. We wrestled for 3 days and 3 nights. Rose says every time Troy tells that story, he finds a different way to tell it, different things to make up about it. Well, in mocking death this way, because he was very sick afterward, in mocking death this way, Troy seems to be tempting fate. His hubris extends to claims that he also, quote, talked to the devil. But coexisting with this pride are recollections of humiliation that he confesses to Rose in the same abject spirit of self-doubt that Willie confessed his failures to Linda. And chief among these confessions is the financial and moral debt that Troy owes to his older brother Gabriel, who suffered a serious brain injury fighting in World War II for a country that treats Gabe as a second-class citizen. This is something for which Troy feels profoundly guilty and humiliated, the fact that he would have to rely on the government payout to his wounded brother. He tells Rose, man, go over there and fight the war, messing around with them Japs, get half his head blown off, and they give him a lousy $3,000, and I had to swoop down on that. That's the only way I got a roof over my head, 'cause that metal plate of his. Rose says, can't nobody say you ain't done what was right by Gabe. Look how long you took care of him. To which Troy replies, if my brother didn't have that metal plate in his head, I wouldn't have a pot to piss in or a window to throw it out of. And I'm 53 years old. Now see if you can understand that, Rose. Now, note, Troy feels guilty that he has relied on his brother's disability payment to buy the house that they live in. And at age 53, he's embarrassed that he still has to live from paycheck to paycheck. He sounds here a lot like Willie Loman. This economic challenge also informs Troy's emphasis on thrift, as we see when they begin to work on the fence, on the need not to waste money. He tells Corey now, your first chore is to help me with this fence. And when Corey then asks about a television set, he suggests that that's absolutely unnecessary, and later agrees to purchase one perhaps only if and after they have put a new roof on. You see that roof you got over your head? Let me tell you something about the roof. It's been 10 years since that roof was tarred. Thus, he says, I ain't going to pay nobody nothing to help me. Miss a payment, they come and they snatch things right out of your house, okay? Now, soon as I get $200 clear for the roof, then I'll buy a TV. Right now, as soon as I get $264 or whatever, we're going to have the roof tarred. Now, note here that when Corey tries to induce Troy to buy this TV so they can watch baseball games, Troy is understandably resistant and responsible. He seems to be imparting here a lesson, both in hard work and in fiscal responsibility, to his son. In short, he seems in this respect to be teaching Corey in a way that is the antithesis of Willie's misguided claims to Happy and Biff, that money will come to them not by hard work and savings, but simply by being liked. Thus, take care of domestic responsibilities. Tar the roof first, only then a TV. Note that he puts this off, but while this is sound parental advice, we should bear in mind that there is a subtext here. Having a television would, in a certain sense, be a drawback for Troy, because it would keep him home to watch the Pittsburgh Pirates or the World Series, which are the very things that Corey has mentioned. Remember that he's been telling Rose that he's going down to Taylor's bar every Saturday to listen to the Pirates games, okay, or to watch them. But that's a pretext, really, for seeing Alberta, with whom he's been conducting this affair, it turns out about 3 months before the play even opens. So there's some unacknowledged and disingenuous self-interest here, along with the good advice that will put off the television. But Troy's emphasis on hard work, particularly working with one's hands, rather than being liked, sounds like a direct response to and contradiction of Willie's misguided gospel in Death of a Salesman. Here is, in fact, what he says to Corey when Corey accuses his father of not liking him. He says, "Like you? I go out here every morning, bust my butt, putting up with them crackers every day, 'cause I like you? You about the biggest fool I ever saw. It's my job. It's my responsibility. You understand that? A man got to take care of his family. You live in my house. Sleep you behind my bedclothes. Fill your belly with my food, 'cause you're my son. You're my flesh and blood, not 'cause I like you, 'cause it's my duty to take care of you. I owe a responsibility to you. Let's get this straight right here before it go along any further. I ain't got to like you. Mr. Rand don't give me my money come payday 'cause he likes me. He gives it 'cause he owe it to me. I done give you everything I had to give. I give you my life. I gave you your life. Me and your mama worked that out between us. And liking your black ass wasn't part of the bargain. Don't you try to go through life without work. Don't you try and go through life worrying about whether someone like you or not." It's difficult to read that not as a direct response and refutation of Willie Loman. Now, note that unlike Willie, Troy knows and tells his son that popularity will get you nowhere. And the duty and responsibility are the things that matter, and they require hard, diligent work. Troy not only preaches this, but he models it. But what's troubling is the absence in this speech of any expression or admission of love for his son. That principle, after all, that Rose lives by. Troy can't bring himself to say that he even likes Corey, let alone loves him. I put a roof over your house. I sired you. That ought to be enough. Rather, he demands from Corey not just respect and emulation, but continual affirmations of gratitude for the bed he sleeps in and for the meals that he eats. This is grudging and narrow and confining. It's the very constriction and lovelessness, or let us say failure to express love, that Troy himself experienced growing up. He resented it then, and he resents it still as an adult, and yet he reproduces his father's emotional coldness toward his own son and tries to inculcate in Corey the idea somehow that love doesn't seem to matter. Here's how Troy describes his own father when he was growing up, and it certainly informs his own parenting. He says, "Sometimes I wish I hadn't known my daddy. He ain't cared about nothing about no kids. A kid to him wasn't nothing. All he wanted was for you to learn how to walk so you could start working. Man would sit down and eat 2 chickens and then give you maybe a wing. The only thing my daddy cared about was getting them bales of cotton to Mr. Lubin. He ain't knew how to do nothing but farm. No, and he was trapped, and I think he knew it. And I'll say this for him. He felt a responsibility toward us. Yeah, but no love. My daddy ain't had them walking blues. What you talking about? He stayed right there with his family. He was just as evil as he could be. My mama couldn't stand him, couldn't stand that evilness, and so he run all his women off, and they all left him. He wasn't good for nobody. Okay. Now, note that while Troy absconded and preaches to Corey his father's belief in hard work and responsibility, he also inherited and promulgates the father's oppressiveness, his stinginess, his rigidity in this unloving old man. It appears that the old man didn't really love any of his children, but felt a sense of duty toward them. Troy says, I have a sense of duty toward you, a sense of responsibility, but he, I think, does love his son, but he can't admit it. Like his father, Troy feels trapped, and he makes his children feel trapped by his own unhappiness. Troy's father drove his wives away, and his children rebelled against him. Again, we're going to see that Troy reproduces this in certain respects. Unlike his father, however, who stayed right with his family, Troy strays from his. He drives his wife away, not through cruelty, but through his own infidelity, and in that respect differs from his father. Now, Troy's own rebellion against his father began when he had sex with a neighbor girl. It was his first act of resistance against the paternal dominion. He says, when my turn come to head out, I was 14, got to sniffing around Joe Canewell's daughter, and they went into the barn. We didn't know Gray Boy would get loose and wandered back to the house, and my daddy was looking for me. We was down by the creek enjoying ourselves when my daddy come up on us, surprised us. He had them leather straps off the mule and commenced to whooping me like there was no tomorrow. I jumped up, mad and embarrassed. I was scared of my daddy. But see where he was chasing me off so that he could have the gal for himself. When I see what was the matter was, I lost all my fear of my daddy. Right there is where I became a man at 14 years of age. I picked up them reins and commenced to whipping on him, because he was the devil himself. Now, even though Troy rebelled against his father's cruelty, he imitates the father, ironically, by beating the father as the father had been beating him and had certainly beaten him for years. Troy also finds himself becoming like his father by imposing the same coldness and restriction and fear in his own son as his father had imposed on him. He punishes Corey harshly for doing anything that he hasn't authorized, something he rebelled against in his father but reproduces with his own son. Thus, he repeats the sins of the father that he so much hated. Sadly, we realize that Troy actually does love Corey, whereas I think his father probably didn't love him at all. But Troy feels that to acknowledge love for his son would be a sign of paternal weakness, a sign of masculine weakness. His affection for Corey is thus smothered under the weight of his own past and his father's example. But Troy has other tangled feelings for Corey that he refuses to articulate, as well as his love. The most important of these other feelings is clearly his jealousy. On the one hand, Troy wants Corey to succeed, insofar as he wants him to avoid making mistakes he made. He wants him to stay away from crime. He wants him to work diligently. He wants him to accept responsibility for his actions, which Troy did not when he was his son's age, and learned to only later. As he tells his older son, Lyons, quote, I done learned from my mistake and learned to do what's right by it. Again, in this we realize that unlike Willie Loman, Troy is capable of learning from some of his errors at least. But on the other hand, Troy's hostility to the idea of Corey taking a football scholarship and going to college betrays a sense of jealous rivalry. That would be too much success. Troy can't bear to think that his son would succeed where he had failed as an athlete, eclipse him. Now, Rose understands this conflict in Troy and explains it to Corey near the end of the play. His desire for Corey to avoid his own mistakes and move ahead, but not to move ahead in a way that would destroy his own sense of legitimacy. Your daddy wanted you to be everything he wasn't, and at the same time, she says, he tried to make you into everything he was. I don't know if he was right or wrong, but I do know he meant to do more good than he meant to do harm. But there is some part of him that wanted to do harm insofar as his jealousy keeps him from in any way validating or supporting the possibility of Corey's advancement to college and beyond. Also, bear in mind that Troy is almost illiterate, and he certainly wants Corey to stay in school, in high school, and learn more than he has. But even though he doesn't want him, as he says, hauling garbage, he places restrictions on how much Corey can succeed because he is jealous. Citing his own bitter experience as a talented hitter who was kept out of the major leagues because he was black, Troy insists that the same will inevitably happen to Corey, must happen to Corey. But in making this claim, of course, Troy is not only imposing his own past on his son, but couching that jealousy in the language of protective advice. Troy not only refuses to sign a consent form that Corey needs to meet with a college recruiter, but he jeopardizes Corey's place on the high school football team by demanding that he work at the A&P at a time when practice would be going on. A store, ironically, where Troy himself refuses to shop. It's punitive, and it seems driven less by a belief in work than a sense that Corey, in fact, might succeed where he has failed. Corey says, I get good grades, Pop. That's why the recruiter wants to talk to you. You got to keep your grades up to get recruited. This way, I'll be going to college. I'll get a chance. First, you're going to go and get your butt down to the NP and get your job back. Oh, come on, Pop. I got practice. I can't work after school and play football, too. The team needs me. That's what Coach Selman says. I don't care what no one say. I'm the boss, you understand? I'm the boss around here. I do the only saying that counts. Well, this is almost as rigid and punitive as Troy's own father. Now, while Troy absorbed and preaches to Corey his father's belief in hard work, he has clearly then also inherited and promulgated the same oppressiveness that he hated in the stingy, rigid old man. Troy's experience here, then, makes it clear, I think, that he is jealous in a way that he cannot admit to himself, and presents this jealousy sometimes as a form of a kind of tough love, justifying it this way. Rose says, everything that boy he do for you, you know. He wants for you to say, good job, son. That's all Corey wants. To which Troy replies, Rose, I ain't got time for that. He's alive. He's healthy. He's got to make his own way as I made mine. Ain't nobody going to hold his hand when he get out there in that world. Yes, this is all tough love, all good advice, no suggestion that he recognizes his jealousy at all. But Corey sees through that facade and rightly accuses Troy of that kind of desperate competitive jealousy that Troy won't admit. To do so, again, for Troy, would be to betray a kind of masculine weakness. Corey sees this and later says to him, you never want to listen to nobody, and then you want to go and do this to me. Troy says, I ain't done nothing to you. You done it to yourself. Corey says, you didn't have a chance yourself. You're just scared I'm going to be better than you. That's all. It strikes a nerve because Troy says, all right, you done made a mistake. I'm going to tell you what your mistake was. See, you swung at the ball and you didn't hit it. That's strike one. See, you in the batter's box now. You swung and you missed. That's strike one. Don't you strike out. It's a warning. It's a threat. Now, there is something both coercive and dishonest in the way in which Troy also treats Lyons, his older son, by a previous relationship. Even though, as we've seen, Troy mocks the part-time musician for sponging off him on payday and tells him that he should instead go out and get a job, nonetheless, in a rather contradictory way, he allows Rose to give Lyons the $10, thereby feeding in to Lyons' reliance on him, and then refuses to accept repayment or even the prospect of repayment. Instead, he tells his elder son Lyons to put that money in the bank if he's actually got it to give back to him, knowing that Lyons won't do that. It seems then that for all of Troy's preaching to Lyons about thrift and responsibility and hard work and don't make my mistakes, that he also at some level wants to keep his son in debt, just as he repeatedly reminds Corey that he too is indebted to him for his meals, his lodging, and his very existence. Why? Well, I would suggest that the frustrated and economically paralyzed Troy, in this relationship to his sons and his need to keep them in some way indebted to him, is manifesting a kind of midlife crisis, though it's not a phrase that Troy himself would ever use. As he ages, Troy attempts to counter the feelings of powerlessness by asserting dominion over his sons, subordinating them to his will, making them aware of their indebtedness to him, though in different ways. I think the same existential dread associated with aging, this midlife crisis, also accounts for Troy's recurrent thoughts of combating death, which he turns into a kind of mythology. And the midlife crisis also propels his affair with a much younger woman. I believe that it also informs Troy's long-delayed attempt, finally, to become a driver in a job that he has held for many years. His courageous appeal to the union succeeds. He's allowed to drive the garbage truck even though he lacks a license. Driving ain't nothing, he tells Bono. He feels confident that he can do anything a white man can. What he doesn't feel confident about is his own past or his ability finally to rise beyond it, past the point of driving a truck. But as I've noted, even though there are signs in the 1950s of racial progress, incrementally and very small, as I've noted, Troy has no patience for what both Rose and Corey describe as gradual or incremental changes in racial equality within other parts of society. Having reached his 50s, Troy is all the more impatient and refuses to see anything that is simply marginal or slow by way of progress. When, for example, Corey mentions Roberto Clemente, who in 1957 had just started playing for the hometown Pittsburgh Pirates, Troy dismisses the likelihood that this dark-skinned man will ever get a fair chance to play. He tells Corey, I ain't thinking about the Pirates. Got an all-white team there. Got that boy, that Puerto Rican boy, Clemente. Don't even half play him. That boy could be something if they give him a chance. Play him one day and set him on the bench the next. Yes, he feels that, of course, that will never happen. He says, colored guy got to be twice as good before he even get on the team. That's why I don't want you to get all tied up with them sports. Man on the team and what'd get him. To which Corey says, well, you know, the Braves got Hank Aaron and Wes Covington. They're both black players. Aaron hit 2 home runs today. That makes 43. Troy says, Hank Aaron ain't nobody. Hell, I could hit 43 home runs right now. Not off the Major League pitching, you couldn't. To which Troy says, we had better pitching in the Negro Leagues. I hit 7 home runs off Satchel Paige. You can't get no better than that. Don't talk to me about Sandy Koufax. Okay, now you'll note that viewers of this play, when it opened in the mid-1980s, knew that Roberto Clemente went on to defy Troy's predictions. He went on to become a Hall of Fame player. and they knew that Hank Aaron was the all-time home run hitter. But Troy doesn't allow himself to foresee these things because he can't abide the idea of gradual changes in racial justice, and it troubles him that these black men could get ahead in a way that he could not, much as he fears Corey could get ahead as an athlete in a way he could not. They fill him with the same jealous resentment that Corey's football opportunities do. Thus, paradoxically, the social changes that Troy impatiently demands also threaten him when people call attention to them because they seem to awaken his awareness of his own past frustrations and failures in racist America. That others may be moving ahead seems in some way to create in him a corrosive recollection of how he couldn't. Rose says, times have changed from when you were young, Troy. People change. The world's changing around you, and you can't see it. To which Troy then says, woman, I do my best, the best I can. I give you the lint from my pockets. I give you my sweat and my blood. I ain't got no tears. I done spent them. We go upstairs in that room at night, and I fall down on you and try to blast a hole into forever. I get up Monday morning, and I find my lunch on the table, and I go out, and I make my way, find my strength to carry me through to the next Friday. Well, Troy's response to Rose here is evasive. It evades his painful sense that the slow racial progress that she calls attention to casts a light on his own past failures and seems to make them all the more glaring, seems to inflame his jealousy that others might now be doing things in sports that he could not. His description of his daily routine emphasizes the paralysis that he feels and that he tries, having felt it now as a middle-aged man for some time, to break out of, above all, through his affair with Alberta. This affair is not driven by loneliness like Willie's own, or by anything like a simple sexual need, because he describes his fervent lovemaking, you recall in the passage I just read, with Rose. Rather, this affair is driven by his feeling of constriction, paralysis, as he has reached his mid-50s. Rose sees Troy's failures, but she loves him with the same unwavering and protective devotion, as I mentioned, that Linda loves Willie. Even though Corey challenges Troy's authority, he too clearly loves and admires his father. He's surrounded by love. It's not loneliness. Now, bear in mind that the love that Corey feels for his father isn't like Biff's adolescent love for Willie, predicated on lies. Rather, it's based on Corey's awareness of Troy's strength as a provider and as a former athlete. Bono also looks up to Troy and loves Troy in this same way, telling him, quote, I done learned a whole heap of things about life just from watching you, Troy. I done learned to tell where the shit lies, how to tell it from the alfalfa. Well, unlike Willie then, Troy is, in some ways, a legitimate and compelling role model, despite his flaws, despite his jealousy, despite certain betrayals. Corey has, for example, watched and admired him for 17 years. Corey has watched him, and he has tried during that time not only to win Troy's approval, but to emulate him very often. For example, we see Corey trying to imitate Troy's swing with the baseball bat at that cloth ball hanging from the rope in the yard, a reminder of both Troy's prodigious talent as a hitter, but also that rope ball, a bitter reminder of the color barrier that kept Troy from the major leagues. Well, Corey, when he looks at this rope and ball, sees only the first of those meanings, only the symbol of what his father was capable of doing as a ball player. And Rose confirms Corey's esteem for Troy and love for him as a man of prodigious athletic talent. Rose says that Corey's just trying to be like you with the sports, you know. Troy says, I don't want him to be like me. I want him to move as far away from my life as he can. You only decent thing that ever happened to me. I wish him that, a woman like you, but I don't wish him anything else in my life. Well, note that he wants Corey, again, to move up and be something other than a garbage collector. But he wants him to have his own life and to ensure that he has his own life by avoiding the mistakes that he, Troy, himself made. But again, he doesn't want him to rise too much. This is the same kind of competitive pride that fuels Troy's stories about fighting with death and his claim that even now in his 50s he could hit 43 home runs off a major league pitcher, and fuels his comparison of himself to white players. He says, don't come talking to me about me being too old now. No, I just wasn't the right color back then. Hell, I'm 53 years old now and could do better than Selkirk. 269 right now, that's his average. Yeah. Troy sees baseball and his own bittersweet experience as a player in the Negro League as a primary metaphor for his life. And through the baseball metaphor, we come to understand why, in yet another inner contradiction, Troy clings so tightly to what he has, and yet at the same time risks it all by betraying Rose in his affair with Alberta. He wants his house, he wants his wife, and yet risks it in order to break through that fence, if you will, that sense of restriction. Troy tells Corey that each of his acts of resistance to his authority is a strike, and that he had better not strike out. When he does strike out in Act 2, Troy banishes from the house, and comes close to disowning his son. Now, in his own life, Troy conceives of strike 3, not as banishment as he does for Corey, but strike 3 would be death. Troy imagines confronting death as a battle against a pitcher who throws fastballs on the lower outside corner. And Troy thinks he will die only when he swings and misses that pitch. Death would be strike 3, because Troy, for all of his masculine bravado, feels deeply that he has been essentially born with 2 strikes against him. Here's how he puts it to Rose when he tries to explain why he had an affair with and impregnated Alberta. Hearkening back to his own upbringing, he says, maybe I come into the world backwards. I don't know, but you're born with 2 strikes on you, and before you come to the plate, you got to guard it closely, always looking for the curveball in the inside corner. You can't afford to let none get past you. You can't afford a call strike. If you're going down, you should go down swinging. Everything lined up against you. What you going to do? I fooled them, Rose. I bunted. Well, you'll note that in describing how he feels that he has been disadvantaged almost from the moment of his birth, his poverty, the mother he scarcely knew, the father who was so harsh and cruel, he lays emphasis on this to explain his affair, and in particular, how he wanted to move beyond it. I had me a family, a job. I wasn't going to get that last strike. I was on first base looking for one of them boys to knock me in, to get me home, but then midlife came. Now, Troy felt as if being born into poverty, abandoned by his mother and raised by an unloving father, were 2 strikes. And he doesn't mention in these strikes against him his own crimes, the jail time he spent, his earlier dissipation. He doesn't regard those as swings and misses per se, even though he regrets them. No, the first 2 strikes occurred before he ever really became a man. Now, he does take responsibility for those early mistakes, but he suggests that they all trace back to the strikes that he was somehow born and raised with. When he was released from prison and he married Rose, Troy regarded his life with her and as Corey, for a time, as a form of safety, a safeguard against future failure, destitution, and even death. Thus, he says he felt as if he were safe on first base. And he achieved that safety, however, he says, not by swinging wildly, as he would have in his reckless youth, but rather, as he says, by bunting, by being careful. And as he stood there safely and securely on base, he says he placed hope in his sons to knock him in. But as we've seen, Troy, unlike Willie, doesn't really rely on his sons to redeem his failures in late middle age or live through them vicariously. He just wants them to work, and to do so in a more dignified way than he does, but not to succeed too much. Now, you'll note that he also doesn't call his affair with Alberta a swing of the bat, okay? Rather, he refers to this as stealing second base. There I was on first, okay? Do you understand, after 18 years, I wanted to steal second? I stood on first base for 18 years, and I thought, well, God damn it, go for it. It's not easy for me to admit that I've been standing in the same place with you for 18 years. Now, again, bear in mind that he presents this as a kind of personal necessity. And yet the word he uses, steal, is certainly suggestive. He doesn't suggest that he had made a mistake here, but he suggests that while he wanted initially the security of marriage and fatherhood and home life, when he got to be 53, he wanted the novelty of an affair. He wanted to steal second. Now, that word steal implies transgression, of course, but Troy refuses to apologize for his infidelity because he doesn't consider the adulterous relationship that he conducted to be the kind of wild swing of a self-indulgent man. Rather, he presents his affair as a personal necessity that came to him at this particular moment in his life. He justifies it in that respect when he says, you see, with her, I can laugh out loud and it feels good. It reaches all the way down to the bottom of my shoes. I can't give that up. It's just, she gives me a different idea, a different understanding about myself. I can't step out of this house and get away from the pressures and problems. I can be a different man there. I ain't got to wonder how I'm going to pay the bills and get the roof fixed. I can just be part of myself that I ain't never been before. A kind of existential necessity is how he describes this affair driven by his midlife crisis. Now, he justifies it really on two grounds. As a expression of his need for freedom, because he says he feels locked, to use his word, locked in to his marriage and domestic life. I done locked myself into a pattern trying to take care of you, and all I forgot about was myself. Thus, this striking out for freedom through the affair is for him, as he puts it, something that was essential. He didn't really know himself fully until this affair with the younger woman. It's a form of self-discovery at a time when he felt that domestic routine and the burden of supporting a family on a slender salary had robbed him of any authentic sense of self. I can't give that up, he tells Rose. Well, his words betray, I think, the deepest of the many tensions in his character. It's not simply his love for Rose versus some attraction to a younger woman. It's what these two women represent in his life. It's the conflict between Troy's deeply held sense of duty and responsibility to his wife and family versus his need for freedom and masculine self-affirmation outside that fence. And this tension is deeply woven into his personality, but of course it becomes more pronounced as he reaches middle age. Betraying Rose is, in Aristotelian terms, Troy's hamartia. He tells Rose of this affair out of guilt, but also because he sees it as his duty to tell her. But Rose feels doubly betrayed by it. Betrayed first that Troy cheated on her to begin with, and second, that he has inflicted pain on her by telling her about it. "Well, I don't want to know, goddammit," she says. "Maybe you want to wish me and my boy away. Maybe that's what you want. Well, you can't wish us away. I got 18 years of my life invested in you. You ought to have stayed upstairs in my bed where you belong." Now, Rose, whose name suggests something natural and growing, counters Troy's self-defense that this affair with Alberta was a striking out for freedom and a affirmation and discovery of who he was. She counters that with her own very different approach to marriage and a rather different metaphor for her life. Not baseball, but something that would befit a woman named Rose, planting a seed. She tells Troy, "Don't you think I ever wanted other things? Don't you think I had dreams and hopes? What about my life? What about me? Don't you think it ever crossed my mind to want to know other men, that I wanted to lay up somewhere and forget about my responsibilities, that I wanted someone to make me laugh so I could feel good? You're not the only one who's got wants and needs. But I held on to you, Troy. I took my feelings and my wants and my needs and my dreams and I buried them inside you. I planted a seed and watched and prayed over it, and I planted it inside you and waited for it to bloom. And it didn't take me 18 years to find out that the soil was hard and rocky and it wasn't ever going to bloom. But I held on to you, Troy. I held you tighter. I gave up everything I had to try and erase the doubt that you wasn't the finest man in the world. And wherever you was going, I wanted to be there with you." Well, it's a stirring expression of love and rebuttal to Troy's insistence on a kind of masculine freedom. For all of her love and her devotion, Rose admits that the hopes she planted in Troy initially as the fulfillment of her own life didn't all flourish. But instead of betraying him, she clung to him all the more tightly. Indeed, the fence that she wants to build to enclose the house and yard is the visible symbol of her desire to hold on to Troy and her family. As noted, for Troy, the fence is an emblem of restriction, of being held back, or to use his word, being locked in. The fence requires other forms of restriction in his life as well. His father's rigid laws, the incarceration, if you will, that locked him in prison, and of course the baseball color barrier that prevented him, that kept him out of baseball, and in some way locked him into the Negro Leagues. Well, after many years with Rose, he feels that marriage and domestic life are yet another fence. And as he says to Rose, "Just give me some space, that's all. Just give me some room to breathe." Well, seeing this dangerous impulse in Troy, this need to break away from the woman who loves him and holds on to him, his friend Bono tells him, quote, "I want to see you put that fence up by yourself." What Bono means is, I want to see you commit yourself to Rose and give up your philandering with Alberta. Bono recognizes that the fence is a symbol of family unity and holding together rather than moving away. Troy refuses that good advice. And at the end of the confrontation with Rose, when he discloses his affair, he grabs her arm violently. She protests, and hearing this, Corey comes running out of the house into the front yard and tries to defend his mother. In this Oedipalized confrontation, the son throws a punch that knocks Troy down as Rose tries to stop them. Troy restrains himself here because he knows that he's in the wrong. But he tells his son that this now is strike two. One more strike and Corey will be thrown out of the house, beyond that half-built fence that Troy has found himself so confining. Well, 6 months later, we see 3 new developments have occurred. First, Troy and Rose are estranged because he won't stop seeing Alberta, although he returns home each night and spends most of his time elsewhere with his lover. This is a source of guilt for Troy, but Rose reminds him of a second source of guilt that marks a second change that has occurred now over 6 months. Troy has signed a document allowing the authorities to take his war-injured brother Gabe to the state asylum, ensuring that part of Gabe's monthly check will now go to Troy. Up until now, Troy has tried to atone for his guilt for using Gabe's money to buy the house by repeatedly bailing Gabe out of custody when the braid-addled war veteran is arrested for disturbing the peace. But now, Troy sells his brother into state custody for another financial need. He now thinks he'll have to support 2 women and 2 families, thus the need for money. Now, Troy has tried in the past to protect Gabe out of a sense of family duty and gratitude for his military service, as well as the guilt he feels toward him. Ironically, at the same time, the demented Gabe imagines that he's protecting Troy and his family from the harrowing hounds of hell, who in his delusions he imagines is threatening that family. Sending Gabe to an asylum, then, is yet another source of gnawing guilt for Troy, and Rose won't allow him to evade it, or to evade the guilt that she charges him with now for refusing to allow Corey to meet with a football recruiter who could help him get into college and a scholarship. Rose says, "You wouldn't sign the paper for Corey, but you signed it for Gabe. You signed that paper. You done went down there and signed him to the hospital for half his money. You went back on yourself, Troy. You're going to have to answer for that." Well, the third new development now is that Alberta is in labor. But as Troy prepares to go to the hospital, news arrives that the baby, later named Raniel, has been born, but that Alberta has died in childbirth. This crushing disclosure of the power of death prompts what appears to be a moral transformation in Troy, at least initially. Now, in a soliloquy, he no longer describes the fence as a barrier or restriction, but rather as a symbol of protection from death that he wants to stay behind and to keep Rose behind. He says, "All right," with quiet rage, "Mr. Death, see now, I'm going to tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to go and take and build me a fence around this yard. See, I'm going to build me a fence around what belongs to me, and then I want you to stay, Mr. Death, on the other side. See, you stay over there until you're ready for me. This is between you and me, man to man. You stay on the other side of that fence until you're ready for me. Then you come up and knock on the front door anytime you want. I'll be ready for you." The idea of the fence as a form of enclosure and protection seems akin, at least superficially, to Rose's conception of the fence as holding people in together and protectively. But for Troy, it's more a barrier against what he fears than an image of the family unity and solidarity that Rose sees in it. As such, what might appear to be Troy's moment of tragic self-recognition proves to be considerably less. And ironically, Troy's desire to finish the fence as a protective symbol of his desire to keep death and disruption outside comes too late, because Rose has now lost faith in Troy as her husband. When Troy comes back a few days later with the new infant daughter, Rose is willing to care for this child as a mother, a surrogate mother, but not to be a wife to Troy any longer at this point. She makes this unmistakably clear. "I'll take care of your baby for you because, like you said, she's innocent, and you can't visit the sins of the father upon the child. But from right now, this child's got a mother. But you are a womanless man." Rose's words here clearly refer back to Wilson's epigraph. The only way to keep the sins of the father from injuring the child, either by effect or inheritance, is to banish those sins of the father through forgiveness. Rose won't punish the baby for the sins of Troy and Alberta. That is, she'll forgive the result of the sin, but she's not yet ready to forgive the sinner himself, who is pleading here for her help. Only at the end of the play will Rose ensure that Raynell isn't poisoned by the sins of her father, because she will forgive Troy. Now, at the end of the play, after she has forgiven Troy herself, she also urges Corey to forgive him. And clearly, Corey has a lot to forgive, because when Troy spoke of the fence as a form of protection, it clearly did not extend to Corey. Now, shortly thereafter, when Corey tries to enter the house, Troy blocks the steps where he is sitting, and the fight escalates. Troy says, "You a man, now let's see you act like one. Turn your hind around and walk out of this yard. And when you get out there in the alley, you can forget about this house. See, because this is my house. You go on and be a man in your own way. Get out of this house. You can forget about it, because this is mine. You go on and get yours, because I'm through with doing with you." Well, Note that Corey resents Troy at this moment for betraying his mother with the same bitterness that Biff resents Willie Loman when he sees the woman. And when Troy then bars his way and tells Corey that he must leave and essentially live on his own without any further support, Corey denounces Troy on behalf of his mother, on behalf of his Uncle Gabe, and on behalf of himself. Corey makes it clear that Troy has betrayed all of them. You ain't never done nothing but hold me back. Afraid I was going to be better than you. All you ever did was try and make me scared of you. I used to tremble every time you called my name, every time I heard your footsteps in the house, wondering all the time, what's Papa going to say if I do this? What's he going to say if I do that? I don't know how Mom can stand you after what you did to her. Corey's words remind Troy that he is indeed acting like his own oppressive father, the father he hated and feared. He has in some ways become that man. And we wonder what, if anything, then, will keep Corey from becoming the embittered father, Troy, whom he once revered but now seems to hate. Well, perhaps the answer lies in this, in the fact that when Troy invites his son immediately after this to hit him with the baseball bat that Corey has picked up, challenging his own son to hit him, even as he challenges death, Corey can't and won't strike him. But also, and no less important in this fight, is that Troy also stops himself. Troy says, you're going to have to kill me. If you want to draw that back on me, you're going to have to kill me. Corey backed up against a tree, can go no further. Troy taunts him. He sticks out his head and offers it as a target. Come on. Corey is unable to swing the bat. Troy grabs it. Then I'll show you. Corey and Troy struggle over the bat. The struggle is fierce and fully engaged. Troy ultimately is the stronger and takes the bat from Corey and stands over him, ready to swing, but he stops himself. This is a crucial moment. Corey doesn't assault his father with the bat the way Troy had whipped his father when he was a 14-year-old boy. But he does leave his father's house for good. And Troy, even in banishing Corey, refrains from beating his son the way his father had beaten him. In short, each of them seems to recoil against becoming or emulating his father. The bat, this phallic object that had once reflected Corey's admiration of his father as a baseball player when he tried to imitate his swing, now becomes a symbol of Corey's aggression against his father, but also the symbol of Corey's resistance ultimately to reenacting the sins, the violence of his father. Troy sees Corey's resistance to his authority here as strike three, but he feels no sense of joy or victory as he stands over his son. Rather, after Corey has left, Troy shows signs of despair at the end of this scene. Assuming a batting posture, he begins to taunt Death with the bat, the fastball in the outside corner. Come on, it's between you and me now. Come on, Death, anytime you want. Come on, I'll be ready for you, but it ain't going to be easy. Troy taunts Death here in the same language that he had taunted Corey to strike him, and in both cases there seems to be a kind of death wish underlying this male bravado, rooted in despair and guilt. At this moment, Troy is estranged from his wife, burdened by the guilt I've described, alienated from the son whom he loves but can't admit that he loves, and yet too proud even to apologize to his wife and thereby repair or try to repair the damage. He longs for Death at some level. Yet Death doesn't throw his pitch for another 7 to 8 years. The final scene in Act 2, we're told, is set in 1965, on the day of Troy's funeral. He has died, it appears, of a heart attack, as Rose describes it. Yet he seemed to experience death just as he imagined he would, as he stood in the yard with the bat in hand as a 60-year-old man. She describes the event and says, he was out there swinging that bat. I was just ready to go back into the house, and he swung that bat, and then he just fell over. Seemed like he swung it and stood there with this grin on his face, and then he just fell over. They carried him down to the hospital, but it was too late. The grin on Troy's face suggests that he welcomed death even as he fought it. But he died at a time when Rhea and Rose, at least, had become reconciled. This is suggested not just by the now completed fence described in the front yard, but also by the garden that, like Willie, Troy has envisioned and has now planted. An image that picks up Rose's earlier image of planting a seed in Troy. He has now planted seeds in the yard. Rose now feels blessed and rejuvenated as a mother by raising the daughter of Troy's dead lover. And it appears that now, years later, she has indeed forgiven him. She explains it this way. When your daddy walked through the house, he was so big he filled it up. That was my mistake, not to make him leave some room for me, for my part in that matter. But at the same time, I wanted that. I wanted a house that I could sing in, and that's what your daddy gave me. I don't know, to keep up his strength, I had to give up little pieces of mine. I did that. I took on his life as mine and mixed up the pieces so that you couldn't hardly tell which was which. But it was my choice, and I took on Raynell like she was all them babies that I wanted and never had had. Now, in remembering Troy, Rose now emphasizes not what he took from her, but what he gave her. And she even blames herself, not Troy, for investing her entire life in him rather than keeping a piece for herself. In short, she blames herself for smothering Troy with her need for him and clinging to him. Many, I think including me, would say that Rose is being too hard on herself here and exculpating Troy. But this is nonetheless the kind of forgiveness that Wilson suggests in his epigraph. It's the kind of forgiveness as well that Troy could never bring himself to in life. Unlike Rose, Troy couldn't forgive white society. He couldn't forgive his own father. He couldn't forgive Corey's resistance to him. Father and son, indeed, were still estranged when Troy died. But Rose now urges Corey to forgive his father on the day of his funeral, if only so that Corey can avoid repeating Troy's sins by clinging unforgivingly to his bitterness. Corey has been, we learn, in the Marine Corps for 6 years. He went directly out of high school rather than going to college and becoming an athlete as he had hoped. At first, he's unwilling to honor Troy by attending the funeral, though he has come home. And he hopes that by not attending the funeral, he can somehow, in that act of resistance, exorcise his father's continuing influence over his life, much as Biff struggled to exorcise Willie Loman. We're told that Corey says, I can't drag Papa with me everywhere I go. Very much the language Biff talked about in carrying Willie with him everywhere out west. I've got to say no to him. One time in my life, I've got to say no and not go to his funeral. Papa was like a shadow, he explains to his mother, a shadow that followed you everywhere. It weighed on you and it sunk into your flesh. It would wrap around you and lay there until you couldn't tell which was you anymore. The shadow digging into your flesh, trying to crawl in, trying to live through you. Everywhere I looked, Troy Maxon was staring back at me, hiding under my bed in the closet. I'm just saying, I got to find a way to get rid of that shadow, Mama, to get rid of the memory of Troy's cruelty, the memory of Troy's advice, but also the memory of the father that Corey loved and admired so intensely, all of which haunts him. Now, you'll note here that this language of shadows is expressive. Troy, Corey says, cast a shadow over his life, first as a role model and then as a bitter enemy. He could never not think about his father. But Corey, like Biff, internalized the man he resents so deeply that the more he tried to get away, the more the shadow seemed to follow him. And Rose understands this when she says, you're just like him. You got him in you good. Corey says, don't tell me that, Mom. Oh, she says, you're Troy Maxim all over again. Corey says, I don't want to be Troy Maxim. I want to be me. And of course, he's right. He doesn't want to reproduce himself, the father, within himself. But not going to the funeral as a form of exorcism is, as we'll see, not the way to do that. Corey fears becoming his father, and Rose understands that the only way to expel the shadow of the father is not by an act of resistance, not by a gesture of rebellion or resentment, but rather only through what she has done, through an act of forgiveness. Corey embraces that wisdom in two ways. First, he and Ronell honor Troy's memory by singing Troy's song about Blue, the good old dog that Troy sang to both of them. It is their way in which they honor him. And then he reveals his awareness of the importance of the forgiveness that Rose embodies and practices with this simple remark to his younger sister. He tells her, "You go in the house and change them shoes like Mama told you, so we can go to Papa's funeral." Well, Corey is willing to attend now when he hears that Ronell sleeps in his old room. That seems to revive Corey's memories of his pre-adolescent rebellious years. It seems to revive a time when he loved his father rather than feared and resented him. Lyons, on the other hand, seems less capable of casting off his father's sins and legacy, either through forgiveness or example. Like Troy, we find Lyons has spent time in jail, in this case for cashing other people's checks, something that traces back to Troy's cashing Gabriel's government checks. So in a certain sense, he's imitating that gesture of dishonesty. The play ends, though, with Gabriel out for the day from the asylum, trying to welcome Troy to heaven by blowing his trumpet, like his angelic namesake, the archangel. When the brain-damaged man realizes that the mouthpiece has been removed and that no sound is coming out, he begins instead to dance. And we're told, when no sound comes out of the trumpet, it's a trauma, and a sane and normal mind would be unable to withstand. But he, Gabe, begins to dance, a slow, strange dance, eerie and life-giving, a dance of atavistic signature and ritual. He finishes his dance, and the gates of heaven stand open as wide as God's closet, to which Gabe says, "That's the way that go." Now, how are we to interpret these stage directions? Do we see the gates of heaven in Gabe's fantasy, or do we see them rather from the perspective of the dead Troy, who has found his salvation in heaven after a life of tragic struggle and tempestuous inner conflicts? In short, if we see these gates on stage, as we do, according to the stage directions, do we regard them as a hallucination or as a transcendent glimpse of some higher redemptive truth? Well, I don't know that we really can know, and perhaps we're not meant to know for sure, but I am more drawn toward the latter possibility, the transcendence. In his epigraph, Wilson speaks, remember, of divine forgiveness as God's largeness, an expression of God's largeness, a word that applies also to Troy, his own largeness. If human forgiveness is an imitation of God's loving forgiveness, then the implication, I think, at the end is that this final image isn't just a madman's delusion. Rather, Troy has gone to his eternal rest by passing through that final fence, which would be the gates of heaven. Okay.